Sean Brewer, the Chief Executive of NCUK. If I may pass on to panel member colleagues just to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Tayyeb out in the University of Western Australia.
Thanks, John, and good evening from Perth in Western Australia. Good morning to you in the UK if you're in the UK, or good afternoon and good evening wherever else you may be in the world. My name is Tayyeb Shah. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Global Partnerships here at the University of Western Australia. And I've been here just over 18, 19 months. Previously had 12 years at King's College London. Thanks.
Thank you, Tayyeb. Jenny, may I hand to you next?
Thanks, John, and hello everybody. It's wonderful to be participating in this session. I'm Jenny Wattling. I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor International at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. And I've worked in HE for many years as an academic, as well as a part of the senior teams at a number of universities, both in Australia and in the UK. And I'm looking forward to the discussion with colleagues.
Thank you, Jenny. And Brett, over to you.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon. It's 1 a.m. here in New Zealand. Happy to be joining you from this side of the world. My name is Brett and I lead international at the University of Auckland. Been here about 6 years. Previous to that, I was at Michigan State. Before that, as an academic in France and a bit of a stint in the UK. So happy to be joining the panel.
Brett, thank you, and particular thank you for giving up, I wasn't even going to say your evening, the early hours of your morning for us. It really is very much appreciated. Vivienne, I know you've already spoken to the conference, but for anybody who's just recently joined us, perhaps you wouldn't mind reintroducing yourself.
Sure, I'm Vivienne Stern and I'm the Director of Universities UK International.
Great, thank you, Vivienne. I'm going to start off with a couple of generic questions, and I really very much hope that the questions don't all come from me, so let me reiterate again that there is a Q&A facility. Please ask your questions. Both Georgina and I will be monitoring that, and we'll do our very best to relay questions to the panel. Tayyeb, I'll come to you first, and I'll ask the same question of all the panel. Do the panel think that there is still a place for face-to-face teaching of international students in a post-COVID era, or does the move to blended and online learning mean that it is now going to be far harder for us to persuade students to leave their countries and come and study overseas? Tayyeb, over to you first.
Thanks, John. So let's look at the motivations for why international students seek a quality higher education overseas. I think it's often about career development and opportunities, but it's about students exposing themselves to different environments, different cultures, and learning from that international experience as much as learning from their universities and their degrees. That hasn't changed. I don't think that will change. The aspirations that students have, their parents have, their grandparents have, that remains. And certainly in terms of the survey data that I've been looking at, there's a desire to continue with seeking quality higher education overseas from a lot of countries, burgeoning middle classes in emerging countries especially, and that's not going to change. However, it's also worth recognizing that COVID has really pushed online learning to the fore in all universities around the world, and it's become much more accepted as a medium through which to seek education. It does not substitute that on-campus experience, and it certainly doesn't give you the feel and flavor of living in a foreign city. But it does allow for some very interesting possibilities to create blended products where students could perhaps start studying online in their home country and then coming onshore for a period of their degree, thereby making it much more affordable to a wider cross-section of international students.
Thank you, Tayyeb. Jenny, anything you could add to that?
Probably just a couple of points. I think, John, I would agree very much with Tayyeb's analysis and summary as well of the motivations, you know, what it is that makes international students seek out those opportunities. And I think obviously the face-to-face experience provides not just the opportunity to develop their cultural experiences, but I think it also builds a lot of other important traits in students, traits like resilience, being flexible, a whole range of skills that are the sorts of things that set someone off well, I think, for whatever career path it is they are going to pursue. So I would agree that I think there will always be a desire for that face-to-face element to higher education and to learning. But as Tayyeb said, the ability that higher education institutions have developed extremely rapidly to deliver certain aspects of programs online now has certainly opened up opportunities to a much wider range of students, I think, as well as widening the kinds of learning opportunities that we can offer.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. It's interesting that already, in a sense, in an era where we hope COVID is starting to go, that we're talking about opportunities for the future rather than threats of the present. Brett, how do you read the situation in New Zealand? Is it going to be harder, do you think, to attract students to actually come to New Zealand in the future, or do you think we still have that ability to provide the holistic experience that certainly for me is what going to university is all about?
Harder to attract to New Zealand? No. As a matter of fact, our applications to New Zealand are through the roof. The student surveys show that New Zealand is doing pretty well in terms of how the international student markets are perceiving how we've managed the crisis thus far. Knock on wood, that could all flip in an instant, of course. But right now we're seeing an awful lot of demand, a very slow and gradual reopening of our border. So for us, it's really about managing these expectations about how quickly they'll be able to rejoin us. But will there be place for face-to-face down the road? Absolutely. I mean, that's not going away. I mean, university education is, of course, it's about the knowledge and the expertise that you gain, but particularly the undergraduate level, it's also about the whole social experience of young adulthood and transitioning and making your own way, finding your identity. I've got 3 kids in unis in 3 different countries at the moment. You know, they're all, of course, they're doing it for the knowledge, but it's also very, very much the social environment. So what we are thinking here is that after the crisis, face-to-face will certainly be very much an important part of the mix, but we think that the student after the crisis will want probably a sustained sense, a greater sense of agency in terms of choosing the mode and location where they initiate their study. We do think most of them will be seeking a face-to-face component, but perhaps with more flexibility in how much time they spend in that mode and where, for the reasons that my colleagues have outlined.
Great, thank you, Brett. Vivienne, from a helicopter perspective of within the UK, do you think there is a fear amongst vice-chancellors that we will see a dip in number of international students post-COVID, or do you think many of the opportunities that you spoke about earlier will still be there to encourage students to come to this country or indeed overseas countries to study?
Well, I don't think it's because people will suddenly realise that they can do everything that they might have done face-to-face online, that you might see some challenges in student flows. I don't think, I mean, I think as others have said, I think that the experience of studying is so much about the interaction that you have with people in the margins, you know, the experience of living perhaps in a different country, the kind of opportunity to hone language skills in the kind of, you know, real cut and thrust of life in a foreign country, and really the cultural exposure that you get as a result of that. Don't forget, of course, that there are some courses it's more or less impossible to provide fully online. I think that especially in some disciplines where the UK is very strong, creative and cultural disciplines might be a good example. You know, access to maker spaces, access to studios, to kit and equipment. Universities have done a great job of trying to work around the physical access issues, but in some disciplines it's just really important that you are able to get your hands on whatever it is that you're working on, and that won't go away. But the big questions about international student flows in the future, I mean, I mentioned things like affordability of international study in a period in which, you know, economically things might be quite difficult for a while. And also, you know, some of the other forces that might be driving us. I mentioned also, particularly in the UK, the change in fee and loan and immigration status for EU students. So those would be the things that I think would be concerning university leaders.
Great, thank you, Vivienne. Question already coming through, which is related to what we're saying. You mentioned the word fees there, Vivienne, and a question that's just come through on the Q&A is, should universities be considering something that I know was talked about very early in the pandemic, which is whether the fees, particularly for online courses, should be reduced, which in turn would potentially widen access to students who couldn't afford international fees. I'll change the order this time, and Brett, if I may come to you first, do you have any views on the fees for online delivery particularly?
Sure. I'm in the middle of consultation on that question right at the moment, actually. So it's very, very topical. It's a difficult one to benchmark as well. I mean, what we've seen is there have been a few movements. You've seen some initially in the States, some of the very highly endowed private schools making some strong movements on tuition, but in a financial situation where perhaps they didn't rely very heavily on tuition. You've seen a number of institutions here down under, including some in the group of 8, who have offered they called it different things, but let's say a 10 to 20, 25% bursary, or a discount, for not to say the word discount, for the online experience. The challenge that we all face within our institutions is that it's definitely not any cheaper to deliver online than in person. Now, of course, over time, long term, in terms of the infrastructure, perhaps when you're building something to be destined to be online, but in the crisis mode where every institution in the world sort of fell over backwards into this, or perhaps some of them were planning for it and very engaged previously, but in our own case, it was quite a scramble to move to an online setting, and there is no cost savings for the moment in that space. Yet the market research shows very clearly it varies a lot by market, but some markets are absolutely unwilling to pay the same price for an online experience. So we are in consultation mode on this question, probably not so much in the space where a student is online temporarily in the crisis and aiming to come back to campus, but we are consulting on it more in terms of whether we develop a different pricing strategy for our T&E operations or for an online experience, which is intended and designed and budgeted and developed to be entirely online. So we're not there yet, but we're consulting on the question.
Great, thank you. Jenny, I saw you nodding there. Do you have any views on online and fees?
Well, I think I'm I'm in agreement with many of the things Brett has said, not least the fact that certainly in the current circumstances, most universities will be finding that it costs just as much, as he said, for us to deliver online as it does face-to-face. I think that, like Brett, we're also looking to the future and what that might mean in terms of fees, and universities are always reviewing fees. This is something we constantly do. And of course, for international students, this is a major investment for them and their families, and we are aware of that and the pressure that it places onto individuals to come and study overseas. I guess one particular advantage that students may gain from the current circumstances or in the future is if we do have a blended approach to delivery, that students may save some money by not having to live abroad for their entire study, their entire period of study. So that could help to make some programs cheaper. Brett also mentioned T&E, and clearly T&E is an interesting opportunity for universities to work in partnership in other countries and to deliver in country, which is also another, I guess, cheaper option for students. But at the moment, certainly in the UK, I would think it's unlikely that any universities would be looking to lower fees for any online components.
Thank you, Jenny. Tayyeb, any views from Perth on on the online pricing structure?
So as Brett mentioned, a number of the Group of 8 have now started offering an online study rebate or discount, however you want to phrase it. It's a discussion that we're having at UWA as well. I think we've also tried to look at other ways in which we can support our international students. Not quite looking at a fee reduction, but I think both my university and Brett's university have offered learning centers in China, for example, for our Chinese students, so they can actually live and study on campus at a partner university. So they benefit from that peer support and academic support and campus environment alongside their online study. But I will say that philosophically, it's hard to justify charging an international student the high fee for studying online when they're not getting a campus experience, and they're certainly not getting the internationalization experience that they sought, and committing to that high free price point. So I do think that we as a sector need to address that, and I certainly believe that we should look at some form of fee reduction, notwithstanding all the comments that Jenny and Brett have made, that it's costing universities a lot to move to online, and not online by necessity, but online by design. Because we're now in that sort of phase 2 where we had a mad rush to get everything online, and it was a lot of Zoom and pre-recorded lectures and PDFs, etc. But now looking at how can we pedagogically make these much more sophisticated and embracing the instructional design capabilities that online affords. And in trying to upgrade them, we're now investing a lot more as well. So I don't have the answer. I don't have a quick and easy solution to it, but I know that I recognize the sentiment when I speak to international students and their parents and to agents that it's hard to justify charging an international student the same fee as the international students that are currently here at UWA in Perth. And so we do need to address that. We'll come up with some kind of, as I said, it's whether it's a fee rebate or a technology rebate's another one that's being talked about. So allowing them access to invest in better IT equipment, etc. So it's a way of recognizing the pain that some of our students are going through, and we as universities have to look at coming up with solutions to address that. That's part and parcel of what we should be doing. But also we do need, as a sector, a broader conversation as to how we go ahead in terms of our pricing structure for international students.
Thank you, Tayyeb. We started the session in a sense agreeing that we would return hopefully to more face-to-face teaching in the future. Vivienne, I'm just intrigued. In my time at universities, clearly income from international students has been seen as an important part of the profit and loss account of most universities. In your talk, you spoke about affordability of international education. So whilst we just had an interesting discussion around the pricing for online teaching, I wonder what your views are on the pricing of face-to-face teaching and, in effect, the premium that we have traditionally charged all over the world for non-domestic students coming and studying as international students at our universities. And if I just may add to that, I went to a conference a couple of years ago out in the US where the University of Arizona, I think it was, talked about charging a premium for the first year of study for international students, but thereafter, recognizing that there was a higher cost of recruiting those students, thereafter they charged them the same fees as their domestic students because they felt they were part of that university group, and it cost no more to teach a non-US student than it did to teach an overseas student. So perhaps a long-winded question from me, but it's just generally, do you think there needs to be a rethink of the fees that we charge to international students, whether they are studying online or face-to-face?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say, these things aren't static. I mean, universities will set prices with reference to all sorts of things, including you know, who they're up against in terms of competition for those students, you know, who they're trying to attract, and as others have mentioned, that there will also be strategies in place to help those who couldn't afford those fees, where the university really has a strong interest in attracting, either for reasons of diversity on campus or because they really are seeking outstanding students. So I think, you know, that you can sort of see the way that universities right around the world kind of talk to each other in fee levels, and I think that's part of it. In the UK, of course, it's important to reflect the fact that it's not just that universities arbitrarily charge international students more than domestic students. They get a subsidy from government for teaching high cost subjects for domestic students. Now that subsidy has reduced over recent years, but it's still there. So the fee that a home student, and until this year an EU student, would pay to a UK university doesn't necessarily reflect the full cost to the university of teaching that, or the income that they get for it. The other dimension is that, you know, there's a how long is a piece of string question when it comes to cost and delivery of higher education. It is not the case that University X delivering subject Y will do so in exactly the same way as a university down the road, halfway across the country, in another country. There is a slight how long is a piece of string dimension to this, that the more a university invests in facilities, in teaching staff, in the environment, you would hope the better the learning opportunities for the student will be. Now, those things might not always follow, but I mean, Brett and I, for example, have got an active conversation been going on for a couple of years about investment in career development. And I'd like to see universities putting a lot more into supporting international graduates to re-enter the labour market around the world. That won't be free. It involves universities deciding that they want to direct more resources into career services. And so, you know, if I was making the choice, I'd say I wouldn't go as a student for the cheapest option. I'd go for the one that most closely matched what I really wanted to get out of this once in a lifetime opportunity. Having said all of that, I think what we'll see is greater choice available to international students. I think we'll see universities with more flexible modes of study. As Brett said, there'll be different sorts of start dates. There'll be different ways of combining study in your home country with study in, you know, the destination country, and more choice is probably a good thing, basically.
Great, thank you, Vivienne. Lots of nods from Brett there. Brett, have you got anything to add?
Well, I've experienced this in, gosh, several European markets, and then in the States, in the public and the private. You know, underpinning these differences traditionally, for the past, I don't know how many years I've been writing the fees papers, has been the idea that the local taxpayer has been, you know, paying into the tax system that is subsidizing the public education for the local student, whereas the foreign student hasn't been. I was working in the States during a period when the amount that was coming from the state, you know, was going down to, you know, the distinction with the private is quite low. Here in New Zealand, it remains relatively significant. So we have, as Vivienne was explaining, there is a sizable subsidy from government that, you know, tuition only covers one portion of our costs, and we don't get that same subsidy for the international students. There is a necessity component to it. In New Zealand, we have a really interesting strategy, though, where we charge PhD students at the same rate. So government does subsidize PhD students regardless of residency, on condition that the universities not charge a premium for international students at the PhD level. So that is a very a partnership decision made by government about 15 years ago to go ahead and subsidize those two things in parallel for a set of benefits that we have largely realized. We've doubled our national PhD cohort as a result of that. So in some instances, it makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, you know, it is a good that families do make very large investments in, and there's all sorts of different sensitivities in terms of pricing. There are some markets where if you're highly ranked and your price isn't high enough, it's almost a detractor. I mean, you know, in other markets where an emerging market, for example, where, you know, they really are quite a ways away from being able to afford not only what it costs for your tuition, but then just the sheer cost of living difference that might exist between that country and the destination. So I think it varies a lot. I think we will see quite likely some movement in this space. And I actually think that there will be long-term, probably a growing distinction for the online component, despite everything I said earlier. And I think also that the T&E, the ability to start in your home market with some oversight from the destination system, if not destination university, as both a time-saving and a cost-saving exercise, will be more important than before after the crisis.
Great, thank you, Brett. We've got a question that's just come in, and I'm going to go to Jenny first and then Tayyeb for this. And it's actually a question that in many ways relates to all students, whether international or not. And we've discussed the move to online, but also the inevitable challenges that courses, programs that involve laboratory settings, maybe healthcare courses, engineering courses. What solutions are universities putting in place to enable students, both domestically and internationally, to continue their studies when their courses almost inevitably involve face-to-face contact in a laboratory type setting? Jenny, perhaps I can throw that one to you first and then go to Tayyeb.
Sure, John, thanks. So I think there's a range of approaches here, and I guess it depends. So when you say online, it depends on whether you mean everything is online. In other words, we have to move 100% online, or whether you're speaking about a blended approach. Now, clearly, universities where we can blend, so for example, in the UK at the moment, even though we are in a lockdown, university campuses are still open. And my own university, along with many others, is offering on-campus experience to students, obviously much reduced, but it is still there. And so we are prioritizing those disciplines where there is a need for access to laboratories, or as Vivienne mentioned in the creative industries area, access to studios and other kinds of physical, if you like, facilities that you really need to be able to use while you are learning. So that's one approach, is that we are ensuring that that is still there, but much reduced. And then to augment that, we are offering students much more access to pre-recorded material, so video material. And there's a lot of this now being developed, particularly in the STEM areas, to sort of replace some elements of the laboratory experience. So that's another thing that we're including in the options for students. And then, of course, we have the whole AR and VR technologies that are, I think, being explored very seriously by universities around the world, and how we can incorporate those into our teaching. So long as students have access to the appropriate technology, regardless of where they are, they can have a very realistic experience that might help to replace that face-to-face laboratory or studio work. But again, going back to our very first question, I can't imagine that we will ever move to a completely 100% online experience for all disciplines.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Tayyeb, can you perhaps avail us of your experiences and thoughts from UWA in terms of how you're coping with those courses that do require more face-to-face contact at the present time?
So we're in a somewhat different position to a lot of universities around the world at the moment, in that there is no COVID here in Western Australia, and our campus has been fully operational for the last 4 months. That's at the price of having the international borders closed, of course. So we do have a significant number of Chinese students, especially, who are stuck overseas and have been since February this year. But so on campus, the international students are engaging in their labs and practicals, as you would expect, with social distancing, of course. In China, as I mentioned, we have learning centers, and we've tried to access partner university facilities for those students who require a practical component, let's say for engineering. In Singapore, we've agreed arrangements with the 2 main universities who have medical schools for second, third, and fourth year medical students who are stuck overseas. So we've encouraged them to fly into Singapore and essentially reside in Singapore doing those clinical components that clearly you cannot do online. So we've had to try and come up with solutions depending on each discipline. And we have to recognize that, yes, we can embrace technology more. And a number of our academic colleagues have brought in virtual labs and so on. But they're really not a substitute for the real hands-on experiences Vivienne mentioned earlier. The other thing that we've tried to do is just reconfigure the way that students study their units to try and front load the more theoretical ones now, whilst they're stuck overseas, and then backload the more practical elements where pedagogically possible. And so it's a mixture of these different initiatives that we're trying to cater as best we can for our students, recognizing they're not perfect and recognizing that a number of students have opted to either go down to half load or to defer, because they really do want that genuine hands-on practical experience that you get in the labs, that you get in clinical settings, etc.
Thank you, Tayyeb. I'm conscious we've got about 17 minutes to go and we will finish on time. So can I encourage the audience, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A facility to fire those questions in so that we can make best use of the time that we have available. What I want to do, certainly for the next few minutes, is just to broaden the thoughts around TNE. And I know Sir Steve Smith, who Vivienne referred to earlier, who is now the ambassador, the champion for international education in the UK, is very positive about the role that TNE can play, particularly universities using partnerships around the world to deliver education in country for students, overseas students who might otherwise travel. Jenny, is that something that MMU have been looking at or considering as a way forward?
John, well, like many universities, we already engage in TNE, but we are certainly looking at expanding, I suppose, our TNE partnerships, but in a fairly focused way, recognizing that it's probably counterproductive, to take on too many partnership arrangements of this kind, because we're very much focused on ensuring the quality of the experience for students. And our view is that it's better to have fewer high quality partnerships of this nature than to try and fill our books up with many different partnerships all over the world. So we're definitely working on TNE. Of course, it depends on the region and the nation in which you are looking to deliver the TNE, the kind of partnership that you develop. It's easier in some parts of the world than it is in others. But it is a very, I think it is something that is certainly of great interest or increasing interest to students in some parts of the world because of a number of the things we've been discussing today, the costs associated with travel, the difficulty of traveling from some parts of the world at the moment. And so I think there will be an increasing interest in TNE.
Thank you, Jenny. Great. Brett, from a New Zealand perspective, Auckland perspective, where is TNE sitting on your agenda at the moment?
Very high. So New Zealand hasn't had the TNE footprint that some other markets have had, definitely not anywhere near the UK. We've had a long run of being very successful, primarily in bringing students all the way to New Zealand to do the majority of their study. The percentage of students in a TNE setting has been quite a small slice of the pie. But we've been, before the crisis, we were in several conversations about moving that forward. The University of Auckland, we put forward a TNE strategy in 2016. Prior to that, our previous DVCA was staunchly opposed to any arrangements that resulted in advanced standing. So it was quite a 180 for us. And we have rolled out a number of joint programs in a large-scale joint institute in China under the Chinese Ministry of Education for 1/3 rule. And that has stood us in good stead to operationalize these China Learning Centers that my colleague from UWA was referring to, because they've done something similar. And so we allowed students to relocate. They're still studying online with us entirely, but they get local learning support and they're staying on a Chinese campus. We've given them a relocation package and their living expenses there are quite low. And that was really interesting during the crisis. We had a number of students who took a look at that and then reconfirmed their intention to continue to study online at home, but offering that alternative was very positive in terms of our engagement and retention rates. We think that after the crisis, we'll retain some of that activity, but moving from what we're doing now is offering pretty much, there's only a handful of courses that we're not offering online for all of 2021. So that means you have some clusters of students in significant number where you can put the resource in and focus on a dedicated cohort, and lots of ones and twos where that's not quite so easy. So post-pandemic, when the borders are reopened at volume, we would be looking at those sort of locations and indeed some of our collaboration with NCUK as a sizable stepping stone, where a student might do foundation or perhaps their first year of studies as an accelerator and as a savings overall before they come to New Zealand to finish. So we think TNE will be increasingly important. Our government is pushing this agenda quite significantly. So our previous government and our recently re-elected and re-strengthened government. So TNE is very much on the agenda, and I've got a sector meeting. We'll be talking about the New Zealand collaboration with NCUK on Thursday in Wellington with the other 7 universities. So front and center.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you for referring to our new collaboration with Education New Zealand, which of course we're all delighted about. Vivienne, are you sensing a different sort of mood music thinking around TNE within the UK sector at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big story, and it's funny what Jenny says is borne out by the kind of sector level data that actually in the last 2 years, every year we publish an analysis of the patterns and trends of UK TNE around the world. It's a fantastic piece of work, which I just love, called The Scale and Scope of TNE. And the last 2 years, we've seen a decrease in the number of students enrolled on TNE programs. And you sort of think, well, that's odd. We think it's becoming more important to institutions, but we see a drop in student numbers. But I think the answer is what Jenny's described. So, and actually what Brett was talking about, where you've got institutions that have got TNE partnerships that have grown up over a long period of time, often driven by individuals who've made friends with other individuals and go ahead and put something together, which in some cases the institution doesn't know that much about. And at a strategic level, I think universities have been going through and gardening those. So trying to work out what makes really good strategic sense. What do you really want to invest in so you can actually make sure that the quality is high and that you're really keeping an eye on what's happening through the partnership, and less of the very small scale provision. It always sort of slightly puzzles, and if I'm honest, horrifies me that when you look at our scale and scope publication, there are these pockets of individual countries, what I describe as the kind of Vanuatu effect, where you've got 2 students in what is described as a branch campus, and you think that can't possibly be right. And it probably isn't. It's probably the way we report our data. But I think what will happen is universities, in some cases, will retrench in order to make TNE more sort of solid and sustainable. But overall, I think this is going to be more important for the UK. There was a question that came up in the post that I'm going to use this question to sort of hook to, which is there's also a really exciting opportunity here. In many cases, TNE partnerships involve quite a lot of there's a huge time and financial cost to sustaining these partnerships, especially if you're sending flying faculty. The opportunity to collaborate on the delivery of programs with partner institutions, where you bring the best of what you can do in a discipline with the best of what a partner institution can do in a discipline, I think is really exciting. And I think that, I'd like to see more universities thinking about TNE not as not on the kind of franchising kind of validation model where, how can you effectively get more students onto your courses, but just in different ways, but more thinking about how can your university become a gateway to access the best of what is available in this discipline that you're teaching through your network of partnerships. And I think that's quite an exciting opportunity, which in some sense this digital revolution is going to open up.
Vivienne, great, thank you. Tayyeb, can you give us a UWA perspective on TNE? I can see you nodding in agreement with Vivienne there.
Yeah, it's interesting that my view on TNE is that it's always evolving in terms of the type, the mode of delivery, the financial model that underpins it. The days of having big, fancy international branch campuses, I think, are diminishing. I may be wrong in that, but I think universities in these financially challenging environment that we're now operating in will be less inclined to that kind of flagship enterprise that is often top-down, VC-led, as a sort of a status symbol almost. What we're seeing instead are much more agile TNE ventures that our universities are investing in and embracing. And I think here again we can throw in online delivery, because online married to a TNE relationship creates for some interesting combinations. So I think we will continue to see that evolution in terms of the TNE model, whether it's the financial model, the delivery model, and the academic model that underpins it. And the point that Vivienne makes actually links into something that I often talk about. It's about how we're giving our students a genuine internationalization experience where they're truly interfacing with students around the world. And how we do that is now, we try to do that often through physical mobility, less likely because of COVID. Jenny mentioned the expensive travel and the hassle that's going to now come with travel internationally. So we try and look at projects like COIL, which is the Collaborative Online International Learning, or virtual mobility, as a model for how we can get students genuinely interacting on projects, on units, and then you create that sort of micro-credentialing approach to TNE and to international education. So again, embracing technology in the TNE space through pedagogy like COIL, whereby you get groups of students working either on a bilateral or multilateral university relationship, very much underpinned by academic champions at these universities, working together on joint projects and assignments over a number of weeks. So they genuinely build relationships with colleagues from different countries around the world. And in doing so, they learn some of the soft skills one associates with internationalization. So I think, Jenny, you mentioned resilience and so flexibility, the ability to respect cross-culturally and work together collaboratively in teams, the sort of skills that employers are actually now looking for, particularly your multinational employers who often have project teams dotted around the world. And you'll work with people that you'll never meet face-to-face. And so COIL, virtual mobility, provides you with those soft skills that we as universities need to provide much more. And I think that this is, again, is a sort of an evolution of the TNE model, that we try and embrace that much more within our learning and teaching, not just for international students, but particularly for domestic students who are, given that there's a lack of international students on campuses, they're also missing out on that experience of interacting with different cultures and races and ethnicities and nationalities, etc.
Thank you, Tayyeb. Now we have 5 minutes left, so I've got one question that I will ask Jenny, Brett and Tayyeb, and then one final question to finish that I will ask Vivienne. And I'm trying to combine, in fact, two questions that have come through on the chat. And to try and bring them together, it's basically saying, are we missing a trick as a sector by not offering enough online education and delivery to postgraduate students, particularly PhD students who may be able to learn online in a much greater way, particularly if they're not doing laboratory-based PhD theses. And in doing so, should we be asking our professors or academics to be much more flexible and open to doing things differently when they come to deliver, particularly to postgraduate students? So it's postgraduate, should we be looking to do a little bit more online, or more online particularly for the arts-based PhD students? And is there a challenge that we need to throw out to academics to be more flexible and open to change in the way that they deliver? So I'll go Jenny, Brett and Tayyeb to answer that question in about 60 seconds each, if you can.
Okay, so thanks, John. And it's an important question, but I think I would answer it by saying that I am seeing that flexibility already amongst my academic colleagues. I think, definitely it has been catalyzed by the pandemic. There's no doubt about that. But after the initial perhaps hesitancy, people have really embraced it and are really looking to use the online, the opportunities it presents to use it more broadly, and certainly in postgraduate. I mean, we already do deliver online masters at Manchester Metropolitan. We are also looking at the PhD question and have partnered with an institution in the US to do that. So the answer is yes, and I don't think people will be hesitant to embrace it. Great,
thank you. Brett?
I would echo some of that. This is already happening at a large scale at our institution. I'm frankly impressed. I started my career as an academic. I've been on the dark side for a long time now. But the speed with which the academic staff were asked to move online, we shut down for a week and then re-emerged online. And then we've come back to campus, gone back to lockdown. I mean, currently in New Zealand, everything's normal. There's about 40 cases, only 4 in the community. So it's quite controlled, and life is very normal in New Zealand. Getting here is a different matter. But the flexibility the academic staff have shown has been amazing. We have not stopped new starts for PhD students online right through all of it. We are also developing quite a few number of fully online masters. And the willingness of the academic staff to embrace the challenge. I've never had to do this in my career, dual delivery. So you are teaching the same course to a number of students who are on campus, and when we reopen, they're required to come to campus. And then you have students offshore online, some of them studying at home, studying at one of these China centers where they were asking them to coordinate with a local tutor. The demand has been extraordinary. And I'm actually really proud at the spirit that our academic staff have brought to this. And I think that will continue, that everyone's looking at it as a chance to refresh their pedagogical approach, probably with a lot of gnashing of teeth and the workload. But overall, I think it is bringing a lot of innovation and a pretty significant pedagogical refresh to the sector.
Great, thank you, Brett. And Tayyeb, your views?
I think the key term there is innovation. The academics have absolutely embraced the desire for innovation, and we're getting some really wonderful ideas that are coming forward. If I look at the PhD space, the fact that we're now willing to entertain the possibility of students starting offshore. So spending a year or two at a partner institution and before they come onshore for a couple of years as well. So that is a model that would not have been talked about pre-COVID. If we look at the master's space, you have a real opportunity to develop some very imaginative master's programs that are aimed perhaps at those who were not interested in going full-time to universities for study anyway, working professionals looking for career advancement. So there's a real opportunity to carve out a niche there, whether that's using micro-credentialings that are stackable and can lead to an award of a PG Cert, a PG Dip, or even a master's. So you can create some really imaginative programs, and I think this is where universities will really stand out, is if they're willing to embrace and be innovative in terms of their products, in terms of the delivery styles, and giving choice to students in its widest possible sense. I mean, we're fortunate. We're in the same time zone as China. We're actually in the same time zone as apparently 60% of the world's population. So we can do a lot of our teaching synchronously, and we have been doing that. So embracing that and having those virtual classrooms operating alongside physical ones has taken some learning for academics, but they've really risen to the challenge. But I think it's very important, as I keep highlighting to colleagues here, is that now's the time to be innovative and really embrace the change. Otherwise, we as a university and indeed as a sector will be left behind.
Great, thank you, Tayyeb. We are pretty much out of time, but I am determined to ask one fairly quick and final question to Vivienne, which is something that you touched on in your talk earlier, which is the decimation of the English language sector in the UK in particular, and whether you think that will have an impact on future recruitment, and whether there is more universities or pathway providers can do to fill that space that the English language school sector is possibly leaving fairly rapidly at the moment because of the current crisis.
Well, I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I just look at what's happened to the ELT sector in the UK, and I think that will have an effect on us. I mean, I guess if you're optimistic, you say that this is a period, a very unusual period, which will come to an end. And at some point, something a bit more like normality would be restored from our perspective in terms of social restrictions, and from Australia and New Zealand perspective in terms of people being able to travel into the country. And at that point, new businesses will take the place of those ones that didn't survive this period. But I think we just need to be keeping an eye on it. We need to be cognizant of the fact that there's an ecosystem, that people who come and study internationally often have started their preparations in a variety of ways, over a long period of time, and so we shouldn't ignore what's happening in other parts of the sector.